Hey guys, I'm Jameson with rogueengineer.com, and today I'm going to show you how I built my deck off the back of the house. We decided to make the deck the full width of the house and about 12 feet deep. Before we did anything, we needed to reach out to our local zoning board and make sure that we had compliance from them and we weren't building within any setbacks. We actually ended up being pretty close to the setbacks. We ended up barely clearing it by 4 feet. Now that we've got our building permit, we were able to start digging our footings. Our local code calls for 42-inch footings. Your code may be different, so always check with your local code before you get started on something like this. Now that the footings were all dug and spaced appropriately, we were able to call for our first inspection. The inspector came out and made sure that the holes were wide enough and deep enough and gave us the okay to proceed with building the deck. Again, our local code calls for 8 inches of concrete at the base of the footing, and we covered more than that with 2 80-pound bags of concrete. We just simply poured those into each hole, added a little bit of water, and let it set up. Now it was time to install our ledger board. You can do so with through bolts or lag screws, but there's a bunch of pre-drilling and a lot of different things involved with that. We opted to go with Simpson Strong Ties timber screws, and that gives us a secure connection, and we simply just drill them straight through. There's no pre-drilling, no nuts and bolts, and it worked out great. Also make sure that it's nice and level before you screw it in. So now that you've got the ledger board installed, you'll need to install your joist hangers, which will be spaced 24 inches on center. I decided to install concealed joist hangers on the outsides of the ledger board because I didn't want ledger board extruding past the outside of the deck. I also installed concealed joist hangers on the joint, and you'll see why in a later step. After installing the ledger board, you'll need to make sure that you install a drip edge on top of the ledger board. This will make sure that any moisture or any rain that comes down will not go behind the ledger board, but rather drip over the front edge of the ledger board. You'll also need to make sure that the drip edge gets tucked up under the existing siding. Now we can set the posts. We set the 2 outside posts first and made sure that they were equal distance from the house. Then we threw a mason line on those 2 posts and set the remaining posts in place, making sure that they were nice and straight so that when we place our beam, we won't have any problems. Also, you'll need to make sure that those posts are nice and plumb, so bring a big level with you and keep checking as you're backfilling those holes. Now to trim the top of the post and cut the notch. We used a laser level to find a level line across all the posts and the house. We measured up from the line on the house to the bottom of the ledger, and then used that distance from the line on the post to the top of where the post needed to be trimmed at. Then we trimmed each post with a chainsaw. You could also use a reciprocating saw, but I thought it would be more fun to cut it with a chainsaw, so that's what I did. After trimming the top of all the posts, we needed to cut the notches in the post to accept the beam. Since we were using a double 2x10 beam, which is 9 1/4 inches wide, we needed to cut a 3-inch by 9 1/4 inch notch. We also used a chainsaw again because it's fun to use a chainsaw. Now it's time to nail the beam together. We nailed ours together with 10D by 3-inch long Simpson Strong Tie nails. The nails should be spaced about 6 inches apart and staggered, one at the top and one at the bottom. For extra security, we decided to flip the beam over and nail the other side as well. Since our beam needed to be 32 feet long, we decided to use 2 16-foot beams and join them together in the middle on a single post. Now it's time to lift the beams in place, and you'll want to make sure that you've got an extra hand here to do that. Now once you've got the beam set in place, you'll need to drill 2 1/2-inch or 5/8 inch holes actually through the beam and through the top of the post. Then you'll connect the beam to the post with 1/2-inch through bolts with nuts and washers on one side. So now it's time to install the deck joist. Since I have a span of less than 10 feet 2 inches, I was allowed to space them 24 on center and use 2x8 by 12s. One end gets secured to the ledger board with the Simpson Strong Tie joist hangers. The other end gets attached to the beam with Simpson Strong Tie hurricane ties. You could also toenail this, but the hurricane ties are just way easier to work with and there's less room for error. Then I used a mason line and I tied it from the joist on one end to the other, and I marked every single joist at the end of the joist, marked a line on that and trimmed off those ends accordingly. One thing that's a little bit different about this decking is that since it's a 32-foot wide deck, I knew that I could span the deck with two 16-foot deck boards. Instead of staggering the joints, I opted to go with one single seam right down the middle. I took a deck board and I sandwiched it between two joists, and I raised it 1 inch above the joist. What this does is that when the deck boards connect to the joist, the ends of all the deck boards will have a full joist to connect to. This helps resist the board ends pulling up from the deck, and it gives a cool little seam down the middle, which I actually kind of like. That deck board that gets sandwiched between the two joists will also need to be notched to overhang the ledger board and the rim joist, which will get added next. So I'm using these Simpson nails to nail on the rim joist, and I like these because they've got the coil nail, but they've also got this glue, so when the nail goes into the rim joist, or through the rim joist rather, and into the joist, this glue actually heats up and melts and kind of glues that connection together for a nice secure connection. And now we add the rim joist, which is going to be two 2x8 by 16 foot boards. Those are going to be secured to the end of each joist with 5 number 10 by 3 inch wood screws. Now we had to install the 4x4 post for the railings. The 4x4 post required 2 1/2-inch through bolts through the joist and the post itself, secured with nuts and washers on the other side. The post that connected to the rim joist needed blocking on the inside, and the through bolts actually needed to be a little bit longer to go through the rim joist, the 4x4 post, and the blocking as well. When installing the post, you need to make sure that they're spaced equidistance apart from one another. Also, need to make sure that they're very plumb. Keep checking this throughout the installation to make sure that they are plumb. Now it's time to install the decking. We opted for 5/4 inch by 6 inch southern yellow pine for the decking, and props to Simpson Strong Tie because they sent me the quick drive screw gun, which was absolutely amazing and made this process go so much faster. You'll see in this video that it's got an auto feed system, which is amazing, and it's actually got these little fingers on the end of the gun that you can put on there, and it centers the screw over the joist and keeps the same distance from the board end, from the edge of the board, on all the screws. So this process flew. So screwing down the deck boards was a breeze. A breeze, that is, until we got to the post. Then we needed to notch it out with a jigsaw. Now we added the 2x4 railings to the post. I did so with my nail gun and some 3.5-inch nails. You could also do it with wood screws. I used one of the remaining 2x4s to space the bottom post off of the deck by 3.5 inches. Now it's time to attach the balusters. Before we did that, we opted to attach the railing so that we had something to base the height of the balusters off. For our railing, we went with a 5/4 inch by 6 inch deck board. So we installed 36-inch balusters, and I based the height of my post off of the 36-inch balusters plus the 3.5-inch spacing from the deck. That way, we didn't need to cut the balusters down to size. I attached them with 2.5-inch Simpson Strong Tie DSV wood screws. The balusters get spaced 3.5 inches apart from each other. We used a spare 2x4 to make sure that we had the correct spacing. After we got the railing all done, we went ahead, came back, and trimmed off all of the excess deck boards, any overhanging boards, rim joists, so on and so forth. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. The deck is finished, and it only took us about a weekend to build it. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram for sneak peeks of upcoming projects. Also, subscribe on YouTube for project videos as well.